Chapter 18, Bierton, a Gospel Standard Cause.
During these times there were several moves initiated by Mrs. Everett for the Bierton Church to become a Gospel Standard listed church, as she had been our secretary and was finding it difficult to obtain supply preachers. Her sister, Mrs. Groom, and her brother-in-law were members of the Presswood Strict and Particular Baptists, and really wanted Bierton to become a listed cause, which meant if Bierton Church were a Gospel Standard cause, there would be no problem in then transferring membership from the Presswood Church to the Bierton Church. I knew some members were quite happy with the ministers that were engaged to speak and did not see the need to become a Gospel Standard listed church. It was during this time we were trying to move back to Bierton that on the 16th of January 1981 the church decided to join the Gospel Standard list of churches. Mr. Hope, pastor of Reading Strict Baptist Church, was the chairman of the meeting, and he agreed to do all the necessary documentation regarding this matter, and we were duly listed as a Gospel Standard cause. Mr. King had made the proposal and seconded by Mrs. Everett, and a unanimous decision by ballot was taken. It was agreed we become a Gospel Standard listed cause. This was not, however, without opposition from without the church. Mr. Dix, the pastor of Dunstable Baptist Chapel, stated to me personally that we were out of order and it was illegal for us to adopt Gospel Standard articles of religion and its rules of conduct. This I write about in the Bierton Crisis 1984. At this time, Ruth Ellis, who had been a great encouragement to my wife and I before I married, and I used to visit her regularly with a friend and have good fellowship, she eventually needed looking after and ended her days in the Bethesda home at Harpenden. I believed it was noted that one could always have choice conversation with Ruth Ellis on spiritual matters. In early 1982, Mr. Collier from Linslade came to the church midweek meeting to our prayer meeting, and he spoke on the subject of the Falklands War. That was because England was at war with Argentina in 1982. He informed the church of the ancient conflict between the Roman Catholic system and the Reformation in Europe, Argentina being a Catholic country. Mr. Collier was a friend of Dr. Ian Paisley, and through his conversation we were able to hear Ian Paisley preach at Mr. Green's church in London. It was always good to hear him preach, as he was an excellent preacher, even though he differed over certain points of doctrine. In connection with Mr. Collier, it was remarked by his family that if he had been disturbed by events in the first 25 years of his pastorate, he was even more profoundly disturbed by developments since. Blatantly heretical statements from the so-called church leaders, the fresh impetus given to the ecumenical drift by the charismatic movement, the historic visit of the Pope to this country in 1982, all these things affected him deeply. His response, however, was not to project himself back into the past in a nostalgia for better days. It was to work for the present and for the future. It was to recognize that God is still working today in raising up a witness to the gospel. He found encouragement in his contact with other ministers, both within his denomination and outside, and it is simply a matter of fact that the extent of such contact increased in his latter days. At this time there was a memorial rally in Oxford to remember the martyrs Cranmere, Latimer and Ridley, and I remember Ian Paisley echoing the words, "Fear not, we shall light a fire in England that will never be put out." Shortly after the accession of Mary in 1553, a summons was sent to Latimer to appear before the council at Westminster. Though he might have escaped his flight, and though he knew, as he quaintly remarked, Smithfield already groaned for him, he at once joyfully obeyed. The pursuant, he said, was a welcome messenger. The hardship of his imprisonment and the long disputations at Oxford toiled severely on his health, but he endured all with unbroken cheerfulness. On the 16th of October 1555, Hugh Latimer and Ridley were led to the stake at Oxford. Never was man more free than Latimer from the taint of fanaticism, or less dominated by vainglory, but the motives which now inspired his courage not only placed him beyond the influence of fear, but also enabled him to taste in dying an ineffable thrill of victorious achievement. Ridley he greeted with the words, "Be of good courage, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England that, I trust, shall never be put out." He received the flames, as it were, embracing it, after he had stroked his face with his hands, and as it were bathed them a little in the fire. He soon died, as it appeared, with very little pain or none. Archbishop Cranmer, on the day of his execution, he dramatically withdrew his recantation, to die a heretic to Roman Catholics and a martyr to others. His legacy lives on within the Church of England through the Books of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles, an Anglican statement of faith derived from his work. He renounced the recantations that he had written or signed with his own hand since his degradation, and as such he stated his hand be punished by being burnt first. He then said, "As for the Pope, I refuse him as Christ's enemy and Antichrist and all of his false doctrine." He was pulled from the pulpit and taken where Latimer and Ridley had been burned 6 months before. As the flames drew round him, he fulfilled his promise by placing his right hand into the heart of the fire, and his dying words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens opened and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." Whilst these things were going on, my brother got into serious trouble. His business was failing, and he became very depressed, so much so he did not know how to sort out some of his problems. He came to me one day explaining that he had sold his Rolls-Royce to a person in Milton Keynes for £7,000, and he was still owed £3,500. He was too ill to sort it out. The person kept giving him one excuse after another as to why he couldn't pay the money. I felt indignant and was not prepared to sit down and see one take advantage of my brother Michael because he was ill and could not sort his problems out. I said to Michael, "Come on, we'll go and see him and sort it out." I dressed in my combi overcoat and suit and looked very official, and we went to the person's home in Milton Keynes. I told Michael not to worry, I would deal with any problems. When the person answered the door early in the morning, I said who I was and what we had come for, and that I was a Christian and we intended to sort out this matter with the Rolls-Royce. The bloke looked at me, gone out. Michael decided he wanted the car back, and so it was agreed that he would pay £3,500 in cash and take the car back. I found out that the previous deal had been between another person as well as this man, and the car was in his garage somewhere else. Also, a problem with a finance company had arisen. This all seemed straightforward, and we left with the intention, or so I thought, to return with £3,500 cash and collect the car that day. My brother then explained that he understood that these men had raised money through a finance company to buy the car, and he only got half the money. I then feared if we give them £3,500 cash, he would lose that as well, as the finance company would claim ownership of the car. He had already gone to the police, but the police said it was not a problem they could deal with. So my brother felt let down about the whole issue. He said he could not remember signing any form with the finance company, but I began to feel the case was not as straightforward as it first seemed. Michael kept saying he could not remember what had happened. I got the impression that Michael had been party to some deal and was keeping something from me, and these men had just tucked him up for £3,500, and they now had no intention to pay Michael. Michael informed me years later that he did not know about this, and that these men took advantage of him whilst he was ill. Michael decided to get his car back, so he paid a couple of heavy friends £250 to go and collect his car. Sure enough, the next day the Rolls-Royce was in bed in my garage at Bierton, out of the way. I felt much better, even though my brother didn't. This did not stop my brother worrying, because apparently there was more to it than first met the eye. There was some problem with the finance company. I felt let down by Michael for not telling me all that had happened. Had he told me all this in the beginning, instead of being devious, Michael now tells me I was wrong. I could have helped him. In the end, the finance company contacted Michael, and he by then realised the car belonged to the finance company. Michael, through not being able to cope with worry, agreed to return the car, as he realised the deal they had done was not straightforward. This was all out of my hands, and on reflection, I think it would have been better to keep the car and give the finance company the £3,500, but at the time I was not able to sort the issue out for Michael because he had kept things from me. I felt upset for my brother because he had lost his car and all that money. We are now wise after the event.